We are going to start by writing some steps down here. Here we go. Start by finding your axis of your graph. This is your K value. Okay? There is a mathematical way to find this. Most of us don't need it. Okay? The K value, the axis of the graph, this falls halfway between the highest point and the lowest point. Most of us can just eyeball where this is. Okay? After finding the axis, step 2, find the A value. Okay, the A value is the distance from the axis that you've drawn in step 1 up to either the top or down to the bottom of the curve. Either one. Step 3 for any of these is to find the period of the function. How long it takes to do one full cycle. You are then going to use this to find B. Okay, the period is not actually B. That's the biggest mistake I see on these. You need to find B using the period. And then last but not least, and this is the most important step for sine and cosine and how they will differ, is pick a starting point. And we will discuss what that means. Okay, because it means different things for sine and cosine. Your starting point is going to give you your H value. That is where your sine and cosine graph are going to majorly differ. They will be different for each other. They may be different from person to person. There are several different types of right answers for these, and that is okay. What we're going to do is practice writing both sine and cosine graphs. Okay? So in question 1 below, we're going to start by identifying the axis of the graph, where the middle of the graph is. So if I go down here, mostly this is just kind of eyeballing where this is. If you need to, you can average the top point and the bottom point to find where the middle is, but most of us can kind of see, well, the middle of the graph looks about to be here. Okay, you must draw in your new axis because you're going to need to use it several times. Your axis is your K value. So where does this fall? Okay, this means my K value is -3. How do you tell if you got the right axis? Okay, because when you go to count for your A value, and this is always a good check for you to do, you should count up to the top and down to the bottom of a U and make sure those are even. Either way, both of those give me the A value as what? 4 for this one. Also, just be a little careful. Sometimes these graphs, if you're looking at them, will count by like halves instead of ones. So just be a little bit careful when you're counting the blocks going up and down. Any issues so far with this? No. So if you got nowhere else than this, you have enough to say, okay, I would lead with the 4 in front of the sign, and I would end with the -3, the K value at the end.
How do you already know?
Because you're doing both.
Oh, okay.
So you can start both equations for sine, for cosine, and end both with a -3. So even if you get nothing else, you've started the basic structure of this. Okay? These stay all the same up until you hit the last step. Both equations are going to be exactly the same. Now, for some of you, this will be the most difficult part, finding the period of the function. The period is how long it takes to do one full cycle of the graph. If you can start right on the y-axis to count that, I would do it, but this one is a little bit difficult to count with that because that's not an even point on the y-axis. So to count the period of the function on this one, I started here. Where is that point? What is that x value? -pi/6. Okay? So if I start there, I have to go through all the negatives. Then I go through what? All the positives. And I end right here. Because I've ended back where I've started before it starts going to the negatives. Where is here? 3pi/2. The period is how long it takes to go that full distance. How am I going to find that? subtract. Okay, 3 pi over 2 minus negative pi over 6. What are we going to need for that? Common denominator of 6th. This is 9 pi over 6 plus pi over 6 gives me 10 pi over 6, which reduces to what? 5 pi over 3. Now, once you have the period of the function, this is not your b value. You need to use it to find your b value. To find your b value, you do 2 pi over the period or multiply by the reciprocal. So in this case, what am I going to do? 2 pi times what? 3 over 5 pi. What's going to cancel? The pi's. And what's it going to give me for my b value? 6 over 5. If I go back to my equations up at the top, where does that b value go? Directly after sine, directly after cosine, before the parentheses that has the x in it. All right. We've done step 1 through 3. Step 4 is not difficult. You must just know some rules for it, okay? You may want to draw this above if you have any space. Basic parent functions, if we remember these. The sine graph. If I was just to draw a small sketch of the sine graph, where does it start? At 0. And if I was to draw where it goes after that, where does it go? It goes up, and then it goes where? Down, and then it goes through the negatives, right? So if I'm just drawing a small little sketch, that's a good idea of what my sine graph looks like. Okay? I'm not being real specific. I just need to know kind of what it looks like, where it starts and where it goes first. Okay, let's do the same thing for a cosine graph. Where does my cosine graph start? Up at a maximum, it goes down into the minimums, and then ends back up at a maximum again, like that, right? All right, so 2 things you need to know for each of these. When you are writing a sine function, which we're writing a sine and a cosine, so we need to know both, sine starts on the axis. Okay, because we said sine starts right here on the axis. Before we ever started moving anything, the axis was the x-axis. Okay? Also, another thing you need to know is sine goes up first. And what I mean by that is it starts on the axis and it starts going into the positives first. That's going to help us know whether our a value is positive or negative. Cosine's a bit easier and a little bit more obvious. Okay?
Like an H or a K, can that just change that?
It can change that, and we're going to talk about it. Cosine is a bit more obvious. Where does cosine start? Cosine starts at a max. Okay? That's all you need to know about cosine. Because if you start at a min instead of a max, that tells me it's going to be negative because you're starting at the opposite side. All right? So this tells us how to find our h and our k. Sine starts on the axis. So when you pick a starting point for sine, you must pick a starting point on the axis that you've drawn. Where's my axis that I've drawn here? -2. That means I need to pick a point somewhere along that line that I've drawn. So let me show you something here. Okay? You could pick that point. You could pick this point. You could pick this point, this point, this point. Any of the ones on that axis that I've drawn, not the x-axis, the axis that you've drawn in there. I encourage you to pick one close to the middle for multiple reasons. Number one, the further you get out, the less likely you are to count correctly to where that point actually is. Okay, the further we get out from 0, the less likely we are to know what that is. Also, it makes it a little bit easier to grade just because there's not 15 varieties for me to look at. There's only like maybe 2 or 3. But if you do pick another one, I am capable of looking for that. So for my sine graph, I would probably, just being me, pick this point right here. Okay, I know where that is. We've already talked about that point. What's the x value of this point right here? negative pi over 6. How do I show negative pi over 6 in terms of one of these equations? When I put it in the parentheses, I put it in as what? Yep, so I go to my sine graph and I put, or my sine equation, I put in plus pi over 6. The last thing to determine is whether to put a negative out front or not. We said sine starts on the axis and the parent function goes which way first? Up. This point we've chosen starts on the axis and goes which way right after it? Down. Because it does the opposite of what sine usually does, I throw a negative out front. If it does the same thing as sine usually does, I choose a positive. You could have chosen this point over here. You would have a different h value, and it would be going up first so that it would be positive. So that's going to be different than the person next to you if you choose that. That's okay. That's fine. Now we do the same thing for the cosine graph, only because the cosine graph starts differently. We said the cosine graph starts at what kind of point? A maximum. Since cosine starts at a max, you must choose a max or a min to start cosine. Okay? So, where would we like to pick to start our cosine function? I think that's a nice point right there. What's the x value of that point right here? Pi over 4. Okay, it's halfway to pi over 2. How do I show right pi over 4 in my formula? Minus pi over 4. Cosine typically starts at a max. We have chosen a what? Min. So what do I have to do? Make it negative. Okay? The first time takes forever long to get through that. It does. We will get better at it, I promise. We're going to practice this 2 more times and we'll be done. Okay? I'd like you to flip to the back.
But those are both right.
Those are both right. Yes, they are the same thing. It's because they start at different points. Cosine versus sine. Okay? Flip to the back.
Are we ever gonna have like gonna give us one that's like sine?
No. Not crazy. All right. On question 2, I want you to get started on your own. I want you to try to find the axis of the graph, the k value, the a value, and see if you can identify what the period of the graph is. Okay, so try to get started on your own. All right, let's talk about how you find the period of this graph real quick. Some of you struggle with that. It is 6. You could have started here at a minimum, gone through all the positives, and ended back at a minimum. That's possible. You could have also started here, gone through the negatives, gone through the positives, and said from negative 1.5 up to 4.5 is also a distance of 6. Either way, that works. So just remember, once you have the period of the function is 6, how do you find your b value? We do 2 pi over the period, which reduces to what for b? Pi over 3. So if you stop at this point in time, you at least have 3 sine followed by your b value. And then put your k at the end. And then you also have 3 cosine followed by your b value. And put your k at the end. All that's left for you to do on this one is to pick a starting point for each one. Okay, so here's the part where we get confused. Listen closely. Sine, you must pick a starting point where? On the axis that we've drawn. Okay, where's a good starting place for sine?
Like the one on the left.
Okay, you could choose this one to the left. That is fine. You could also choose what?
3.
The one right here to the right.
Or 4.
Or 4.5. I would probably stick with the ones closer to the middle just to keep life a little bit easier. If you chose this one to the left, how did you plug it in? It would show plus 1.5. And you'd have to make one small adjustment, which is what? Put a negative out front because sine typically starts on the axis and goes up first. You've chosen a point that goes down first. That's the opposite. If, however, you chose this point to the right, yours would look different because inside it would say x minus 1.5. And what else would be different? The 3 would be positive because this starts on the axis and goes up first, which is like the normal sine graph. Both of those would be correct answers for that. Both of those would be correct. Cosine, we must pick what kind of starting point? Max or min? What is probably the easiest one to pick for this? Okay. A lot of us miss the fact that right here in the middle is a minimum. Why is that the easiest one? Because I don't have to have an h value in there at all. That's 0. There's nothing in here with x then. The only thing I would have to do is say, because I've chosen to start at a minimum, make it negative out front. If, however, you chose 3 or negative 3, it would simply say x either plus or minus 3 inside and be a positive 3 out front. Both of those, all 3 of those would be right. That's 3 answers. Because where does cosine typically start? At a max. And if you've chosen to start at a max, then it would be positive. Okay? Any other questions on that one before we move on to the last one? All right, let's try that once more with number 3. This time try to see as far as you can get on your own. Work against mine up here. I'm going to pause here so we can talk about the starting points for each of them. Any issues up till this point with number 3? We're okay with all of this?
Yes.
It's the starting point where we get a little confused then sometimes. So let's try that again. Sine, we have to pick a starting point where? Sine, we have to pick a starting point that is on the axis. Where is the best one for sine? Right in the middle, which is 0. Okay? If it's 0, you may either put in a plus 0 in the parentheses or nothing in the parentheses. You don't have to have anything in there. The only thing you have to evaluate is sine typically starts on the axis and goes up. Your point starts on the axis and goes where? Down, which means what do I have to do? Put a negative. If you're comfortable without putting the 1 out there for the a value, you don't have to put it. You can if you want. It's not right or wrong either. It's not wrong either way. Okay, cosine, you must pick what kind of point for your starting point? A maximum or a minimum. Now for cosine, if I picked this point or this point, what's the problem with that?
It's wrong.
They're not wrong, but do you know what they are?
No.
Don't pick something you don't know. Okay? I should know this one right here. That's pi over 4. How do I show right pi over 4? X minus pi over 4. Cosine typically starts at a max, so I leave my value what? Positive.
Wait, minus pi over 4? What if I did minus pi over 12?
Are you sure that's what that is? Have we ever talked about that? I'd pick one you just know.
Oh, all I did was pi 4 and then I went to pi 6. I did half of that.
Okay, that's fine.
Would you have counted it wrong?
Because it's to the right pi over 4.
Would you have counted it wrong? Okay.